Hello, I'm Larry Stevens, President of the Hatfield Museum and History Society, and I welcome you to this community program presentation titled Wreck on the Rails. This presentation will look at just some of the many accidents, not all of them, that have occurred over the years along the train and trolley lines through Hatfield, as well as some history about both of these modes of transportation. Back in 1848, Hatfield Township was much like most other townships in Montgomery County, traversed by a small network of roads, most which were nothing more than narrow dirt paths, and the land was settled almost exclusively by large family farms. These farmers raised poultry and animals and grew crops to feed their livestock and families. Some also grew cash crops, crops grown to sell for profit. And the farmers of Hatfield Township, like much of Montgomery County, benefited from their close proximity to the large and rapidly growing city of Philadelphia, where they could go to market their goods. Speed of delivery was, of course, quite important in transporting perishable agricultural goods in those days. But transportation, which at that time was limited to horse and wagons, was slow and, depending on the weather, often very difficult or downright impossible. The dirt roads would become muddy quagmires in heavy rains, and of course heavy snowfalls also created quite a challenge. But that changed in July of 1857 when the North Pennsylvania Railroad Company completed construction of a new railroad line from Philadelphia to Bethlehem, right through the open farmland of Hatfield Township. Hatfield was now a railroad community, making it far easier for Hatfield farmers to get their goods to the city quickly and cheaply. Yes, the train was now the king of transportation for both people and products. But while the railroad was instrumental in bringing prosperity to Hatfield, it also brought with it its share of tragedy. And the earliest record of any train-related disaster here in Hatfield occurred in 1865, less than 8 years after the new railroad line was opened. It was a cold winter morning, February 2nd, 1865, shortly before 10 a.m., when a steam locomotive pulling a freight train through the Orvilla section of Hatfield Township exploded with a force that could be felt for miles around. In fact, a teacher of a schoolhouse near Moorwood, Franconia Township, reported that the windows, shutters, and the whole schoolhouse shook as if there were an earthquake. There were 7 men aboard the locomotive, and the explosion left 5 of them dead, disfigured beyond all recognition. 2 others were badly scalded and burned by the steam, red-hot coals, and cinders that were forced into their flesh by the explosion. They both survived their terrible injuries, although one never did regain his eyesight. Early railroad crossings here in Hatfield were not protected by any kind of automated warning signals, so drivers had to be very cautious whenever approaching one. Horse-pulled buggies were occasionally destroyed and lives lost when a careless driver miscalculated the speed of one of these huge smoke and soot-spewing iron horses. Drivers sometimes also made the big mistake at double-track crossings of not checking for an oncoming train on the second track after a train had passed by on the first track. The first recorded incident of an accident in Hatfield between a train and a carriage was in 1871 and was caused by just this type of double-track hazard. Thursday night, October 5th, 1871, was probably the luckiest day of Jacob Lambert's life. Lambert, a Hatfield doctor, had been returning home from a house call, riding his single-horse wagon north on Cowpath Road from Vine Street, toward his home at the corner of Cowpath Road and Tummenson Avenue. As he approached the railroad crossing, just a stone's throw away from his home, he stopped for a northbound freight train to pass. As soon as the last car had cleared the crossing, he started across the tracks, unaware of a fast-approaching southbound express passenger train. The express locomotive plowed into the wagon, smashing it to pieces and throwing the 58-year-old doctor onto the northbound track. The engineer, realizing that he had struck something, brought his train to an emergency stop. As soon as his train had come to a stop, the engineer noticed a second northbound freight train heading towards the Cowpath Road crossing, unaware that the unconscious Dr. Lambert and the wreckage of his rig was laying in its path. The express engineer signaled the freight engineer of the danger ahead, and the freight locomotive, quote, stopped just in time to save the doctor from being torn to atoms, end quote, according to the Lansdale Reporter. Neighbors carried the doctor home, and although he was covered with bruises, he was apparently otherwise uninjured. An 1873 railroad report listing all accidents that occurred on the line the previous year shows that in February 1872, 86-year-old Morris Yeager was killed while walking on the track. In September of that same year, John Lewis was lucky when he escaped with just an injured foot after being struck by a train while crossing the tracks in front of the train. 2.5 years after his near-death experience with the train, another train ended up contributing to the demise of Hatfield's Dr. Jacob Lambert. Dr. Lambert, who was quite fond of high-spirited horses, was again riding near the same Cowpath Road crossing when a passing train spooked his horse and caused it to bolt. Dr. Lambert was thrown from his carriage, suffered a fractured skull, and died on July 30th, 1874, at the age of 61. A railroad note of interest. The widely used slogan on railroad crossing warning signs, "Stop, Look, and Listen," was first used on the Reading Railroad in 1884. And here are a couple of examples of those early railroad crossing warning signs. In August of 1893, a railroad accident occurred just north of the Union Street crossing. A southbound train of loaded coal cars ran into the rear end of a freight train that was waiting on the track for a third train that was changing tracks at the Hatfield station. The accident resulted in the engine of the coal car, the caboose of the freight train, and several other cars being completely wrecked, and several more derailed. The train's fireman jumped from the train before the engine struck the caboose and escaped serious injury. A brief side note, a fireman of a train was different from firemen that we think of today. Today we think of a fireman as someone who puts out fires, but a fireman on a train was responsible for keeping the fire in the train's boiler burning at just the right temperature to make the train run efficiently. The engineer of the crashed train stayed on the locomotive and miraculously survived with just burns on his hands and a deep cut in his left hand. It took the railroad 24 hours to repair the railroad and remove the debris so that train traffic could resume. The cause of the accident was attributed to the fact that it was raining very hard at the time, obscuring the view of the engineer. In August of 1899, a fatal freight train wreck occurred on the railroad in Hatfield, but we're not sure exactly where. The accident was caused when the axle of one of the cars of a freight train broke. 16 freight cars filled with merchandise were completely demolished, and 2 of the train's crew members were killed in the accident. This is an undated photo from our collection, simply marked "Wreck between Hatfield and Souderton." From the time period of the photo, it is quite possible that it is either from the 1893 coal train wreck above Union Street or perhaps the 1899 freight train wreck, but we can't be sure. Through the 1800s, the train was considered to be the ultimate in transportation. You didn't have to contend with rough, dirty roads that could be chokingly dry and dusty, or a slippery, muddy mess. But then, as the turn of the century approached, along came the electric trolley. The electric trolleys could glide along atop their smooth steel tracks at amazing speeds, and they were unbelievably quiet and clean compared to the noisy, dirty, coal-fired steam trains. In the late 1800s, there was talk about building a new trolley line that would be yet another connection between the cities of Philadelphia and Bethlehem. There was great excitement on this possibility all along the proposed route, including the Hatfield community. Trolleys were able to negotiate very sharp curves and steep hills, unlike the steam engines of the day, making trolley track installation very economical, since they could simply be laid along the side of already present streets. In 1899, the Inland Traction Company began construction of a trolley road through Hatfield. To help you get oriented, the yellow line here is Cowpath Road. The original trolley tracks wove a rather crooked path through Hatfield on its way from Lansdale to Souderton. The many turns in this route through Hatfield required the trolley to operate at a considerably slow speed. The trolley would enter Hatfield through private right-of-ways on land between what is now Squirrel Lane and Orvilla Road. It would turn right onto Orvilla Road, left onto Coffle Road, and then right onto Vine Street. The trolley continued on Vine Street to just before the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad crossing on Vine Street, where it made a 45-degree turn onto Railroad Avenue. For those of you familiar with the Liberty Bell Trail in the borough, the section of the trail between Vine Street and Main Street was where Railroad Avenue once was. When the trolley reached Main Street at the main hotel, it turned left onto Main Street, up to Lincoln Avenue, where it turned right. It proceeded down to the end of East Lincoln Avenue, where it curved onto Market Street. It then followed Market Street onto Union Street and then turned left on Penn Avenue, also known as Hatfield-Souderton Pike, and on out to the Township Line Road. This winding route had no less than 5 sharp 90-degree bends and 4 45-degree bends. This is a closer look at the trolley's route through the borough. This white line represents Main Street, and the arrow is pointing to what was Railroad Avenue. The first electric trolley made its 13-mile trip from Lansdale to Sellersville on April 20th, 1900. As was customary for interurban trolleys, the trolley ran fast in open country, but once in a village or town, it slowly moved through the streets, making frequent stops and navigating the sharp right-angle turns at intersections. This early 1900s postcard photo shows a trolley squeezing by a horse-drawn wagon full of hay as it travels on Main Street, approaching its turn onto Lincoln Avenue. At a time when steam power was supreme and the use of electricity had hardly begun, the electric trolley car was an unbelievable sight. The first time that many people saw an electric light was when they saw one on the electric trolley. The arrival of the trolley that day in April 1900 was met with great enthusiasm, with crowds greeting that first car with cheers and flag waving by the residents of Sellersville, Telford, Souderton, Hatfield, and Lansdale. But these almost silent running trolleys would also eventually claim their share of lives. This is another early 1900s postcard, again showing the trolley at Main Street and Lincoln Avenue. Now, although it appears that this photo captures the moment right before another trolley tragedy, I'm sure that the trolley was actually stopped and waiting for the woman to cross the street. At least, I hope that was the case. The worst disaster ever in Hatfield's history was a train accident that occurred at the Hatfield train station in 1900 over the Labor Day weekend. So terrible was the tragedy that it was called the Hatfield Horror in newspaper headlines. Now, you may be aware that I have done a whole program on just this accident alone, but for tonight's presentation, I will give you a very abbreviated version. It was a foggy Sunday morning, September 2nd, 1900, at 5:20 a.m. when a milk train consisting of 4 milk cars and a passenger coach in the rear left the Bethlehem train station, stopping at stations along its route south to pick up milk from area dairymen as well as some passengers. 45 minutes later, an Atlantic City express train pulled out from Bethlehem Station at 6:05 a.m. Its 10 cars were packed so tightly with people looking forward to a fun day at the shore that they were standing in the aisles. The train picked up speed and soon was traveling between 40 and 50 miles per hour. It was scheduled to pass the Hatfield station at 6:57 a.m. The milk train was scheduled to stop at the Hatfield station at 6:51 a.m. It would then wait at the station for 1.5 minutes for milk to be loaded and then go on to Lansdale, where it would pull onto a siding and wait for the Atlantic City-bound express train to pass. The milk train, however, was running late that day due to a low-lying fog that had settled in the area. The engineer of the excursion train believed that he would have a clear track all the way to Lansdale, and he blew past a warning flag at the Souderton station, believing that it was left out by mistake, and continued on towards Hatfield at full throttle. By the time that he saw the rear of the stopped milk train through the fog, it was too late. Traveling at about 50 miles per hour, the heavy excursion train's engine plowed into the rear coach of the milk train, splitting it from end to end. The first 3 cars that the engine struck were reduced to kindling wood and bent iron. The next car was smashed beyond repair, while the forward car and engine practically escaped damage. The passenger cars of the express train directly behind the engine were torn to pieces and others derailed. There were a number of dairymen at the Hatfield station at the time of the collision, loading milk onto the milk train. One, Hatfield farmer Harvey Landis, was killed and several others were injured. At least 19 people died as a result of the terrible accident, and at least 90 others were injured, some horribly crippled for life. For those of you who would be interested in knowing the complete story of this terrible wreck, a book on the Hatfield Horror story is available. Go to our website, hatfieldhistory.org, for information on how to get this book. It was only 2 years after the new trolley line opened that the first recorded trolley accident in Hatfield occurred, and it was a fatal one at that. It was Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 27th, 1902, around 1:30 in the afternoon. A 52-seat trolley car packed with 70 passengers, including 7 members of the Percy High School football team, was headed south from Souderton. As I mentioned earlier, when the new trolley line tracks were laid through Hatfield in 1899, they just followed the town's streets, which meant that there were a lot of sharp curves along the route. And coming from Souderton, the trolley would travel along the Hatfield-Souderton Pike into Hatfield Borough, where it would make one of those sharp turns right onto Union Street. On that fateful Thanksgiving Day in 1902, as the heavy trolley car traveled along Hatfield-Souderton Pike, it was running at full speed, about 40 miles per hour. As it approached the curve at Union Street, the motorman attempted to apply the trolley's air brake to reduce its speed, but found that the brakes would not work. The distance to the curve was too short for him to attempt to stop the trolley with the handbrake, so instead he reversed the power. But it was of no use, and the trolley entered the curve with such force that, although the wheels remained on the track, the passenger coach snapped off and overturned to one side of the road. The passengers were thrown into a confused mass, and amid the screams of women and children, they struggled to free themselves from the wreck. 15-year-old Wallace Crothamel, a student of Percy High School who was on his way to Lansdale to witness the football game, was standing on the rear platform of the trolley when the accident occurred. He was thrown violently to the ground, breaking his neck, and caused almost instant death. Both of his parents were with him at the time of the accident and assisted in removing his body from the wreck. Joseph Detweiler, a young man from Satterton, was found badly injured and taken from the wreck, more dead than alive. It was thought that he would recover, but his condition took a turn for the worse, and he died on Sunday. Just a week or two earlier, this unfortunate young man was involved in a hunting accident which resulted in a few of his fingers being shot off. He had been on his way to see Hatfield's Dr. Albright for treatment when the trolley accident fatally injured him, just a short distance from the doctor's office. At least 13 other passengers of the trolley sustained injuries in the wreck, some seriously, including cuts and bruises and several broken bones. Upon inspection of the wrecked trolley car, it was found that a bolt had dropped from the brake rod, which rendered the air brakes useless. And the 1902 newspaper account of the accident also reported that the trolley company was working to eliminate some of the worst of the more than 40 sharp curves in the line between Lansdale and Percy. Plans were to remove many of the dangerous curves, making it possible to operate the big trolley cars at a higher rate of speed and yet in safety. 6 years later, in 1908, Hatfield Borough Council granted the trolley company permission to move their tracks to soften the two dangerous sharp curves at the intersections of Market and Union Streets and Union Street and Penn Avenue. In 1913, with the goal of removing the trolley tracks from local roads to increase safety and to eliminate many of the time-consuming curves, the trolley path through Hatfield was straightened considerably. This again shows the original trolley route through Hatfield. And this yellow line shows the new trolley route path. You could see that after leaving Lansdale Borough, the entire route through Hatfield was off of local streets. Here's a closer look of the old trolley route through Hatfield Borough. And here is the new route. Now there was one little problem here in the borough with the new route. The trolley line was still on the local road, Railroad Avenue. The trolley company wanted to close Railroad Avenue, but at that time, the section of Vine Street from the railroad to Main Street was still a private road, and the owner of the private road at that time had no desire for that to change, so closing Railroad Avenue would have made Vine Street a dead-end road with no connection to Main Street. So the trolley company went and purchased a right-of-way through the land of George Didden and built a new road, Butler Avenue, connecting Vine Street to Tillmanson Avenue, which of course connected to Main Street. And Railroad Avenue was then abandoned as a public road. Sometime later, of course, Vine Street was opened straight through to Main Street. Now, when the trolley route was first opened in 1900, there weren't any established stops. You could just wave down the trolley to get on and tell the operator where you wanted to get off. But when the new trolley route was established, with the tracks removed from the local roads, this practice was no longer practical. So, a number of stops were established in Hatfield where passengers could board and leave the trolley. These stops had small shelters to help protect waiting passengers from the elements. In this photo, taken around 1950, you can see passengers waiting for the trolley at the shelter at the Vine Street trolley stop, while a southbound steam engine passes by, puffing its dark smoke. Here again is the new 1913 trolley route. There was a stop just north of the Lansdale-Hatfield Township border, a stop at the Orvilla Road crossing, and a stop at Vine Street crossing that we just looked at. The trolley company also decided to have a passenger and freight station in Hatfield Borough at the Broad Street crossing. As it turned out, this building, located on East Lincoln Avenue on George S. Snyder's property, was right in the path of the new trolley line. At that time, the building was home to a print shop which published the Hatfield Times newspaper. So the trolley company purchased the building and moved it to East Broad Street, where they made it the new Hatfield Trolley Station. And of course today, it is the Trolley Stop Deli. On Tuesday morning, June 24, 1913, Hatfield Borough butcher Samuel K. Fossbender, around 22 years of age, was killed instantly when he and his two-horse team were struck by a southbound express train while crossing the railroad at Orvilla. A newspaper account of the accident reported, quote, "The debris of the wagon with the occupant were carried on the pilot of the engine for 500 yards when the train stopped and removed the wreckage. One of the horses sustained but a few scratches, but the other had a hind leg broken and had to be killed. The body of the dead man was brought to Lansdale, where Undertaker Conver took it in charge. It was not badly mutilated, no parts were missing, but nearly every bone was broken. His watch was still in his pocket and running." End quote. Here's another picture of Sam Fossbender on the left with his brother John and father Sam Sr., probably herding a cow to their butcher shop on South Main Street. In the early 1900s, innovative electric locomotives and electric commuter cars were designed and built to replace the dirty and less efficient steam engines. Starting in 1914, the Pennsylvania Railroad and later the Reading Railroad electrified most of the commuter train routes around Philadelphia. But the Philadelphia to Bethlehem route was only electrified north to Lansdale. So steam locomotives continued to be used on that line into the 1950s, when they were eventually replaced by the diesel locomotive. In 1914, concerned by the number of accidents occurring at the railroad crossings in the borough, Hatfield Borough Council asked that the railroad place an automated safety gate at the busy South Main Street crossing. The railroad rejected the borough's request, but they did agree to supply a flagman for that crossing. 2 years later, in 1916, the railroad agreed to station a flagman at the Union Street crossing as well. The flagman, or a watchman, would wait in little shacks at the crossings from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and stop traffic with a portable stop sign when a train approached the crossing. Dr. Samuel C. Moyer was a prominent area physician in the later 1800s and early 1900s. He went into semi-retirement in the early 1900s, but continued to make house calls in the vicinity. It was while returning to his home on August 4, 1920, from one of these house calls in Hatfield, that Dr. Moyer met his fate. Although he owned an impressive automobile, he was traveling that day in his horse-drawn buggy, which he often used for his personal driving in the countryside. He was traveling on Orvilla Road and turned left onto Schwab Road towards Lansdale when, as he approached the railroad crossing, he didn't notice that a southbound express train was bearing down on him from a blind angle. As the reporter newspaper told the story, Dr. Moyer apparently noticed the train at the very last second and tried to turn his horse to run parallel to the tracks, but it was too late. The engine plowed into the side of the horse, throwing it 40 feet and killing it instantly. The buggy was demolished, and Dr. Moyer was thrown out, fracturing his skull and spinal column, rendering him unconscious. He was placed on a stretcher and taken to Lansdale, where his son, Dr. Herbert T. Moyer, was summoned. Physicians worked on him, but to no avail, and he died about a half an hour after being struck. He was 74 years old. As was the norm at the time, a newspaper article reporting on a Hatfield train accident provided some colorful imagery. At about 10 p.m. on July 13, 1924, an A&P store delivery truck was struck at the Bergy Road railroad crossing, slightly injuring the driver, but killing his passenger. A newspaper graphically reported that the 26-year-old Frank Nolt was ground to pieces in the accident, and his mangled body was transported to the morgue of Undertaker Huff in Lansdale. His death certificate was a bit more tactful, stating only that his head and body were crushed. The bread delivery truck was en route from Philadelphia to stores in Allentown, and it is a bit of a mystery what they were doing on Bergy Road when Bethlehem Pike was the most direct route between the two cities. In 1927, the Lehigh Valley Transit Company, in an effort to improve safety and reduce accidents along the trolley line, replaced the trolley's air whistles with loud, blaring dual air horns on both the passenger and the freight trains. In this photo, you can see the back of Inky Davis's building in the background as the southbound trolley pulls away from the station. On December 19, 1932, 2 people were killed when their automobile was struck by a southbound express train as it crossed the little-used Vine Street crossing. It was little used because, at that time, the road between the tracks and Main Street was still a private road. Mrs. Newton Hoffman, age 40, of Hatfield, died at the scene, while the driver, Leroy Herman, also of Hatfield, died about an hour later in the hospital. This photo shows railroad crossing watchman Harvey Wimmer manning his Union Street post in the 1930s, working to ensure that no train accidents would occur at that crossing, at least between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. In July of 1936, a fast-moving 40-car freight train bound for Bethlehem crashed about a quarter-mile south of the Orville Road crossing after its cars started jumping the track. As more and more cars began leaving the track, some 200 feet of rails were torn up and the ties chopped to pieces by the wheels of the car. Then about 400 feet south of the Orville Road crossing, the midsection of the freight train buckled and the cars reared up almost on end and piled on top of each other. Fire broke out in a boxcar carrying hundreds of 5-gallon cans of alcohol. Many of the cans, crushed by the accident, fed the fire which, at its height, could be seen for a radius of 15 miles around. Firemen from Lansdale and Hatfield were called, but as the Reporter newspaper reported, an enormous amount of damage had already been done before the volunteers had been summoned. None of the 5-man crew was injured, except for the freight conductor, who complained of tenderness and bruising. As if the fire didn't create enough of a mess, a tank car loaded with molasses was ruptured and leaked its gooey contents all around the scene. And I think it's funny how, back then, they would allow anyone to get right up in the accident scene, like these 2 women seen here. Other cars contained tarvia, which is a soft tar product, roofing supplies, and white building stone, which were all scattered along the line of the derailment. Railroad crews had to wait until the fire area cooled off to replace the torn-up track and put the northbound lane back in service. A railroad derrick's crane was brought in to remove all the damaged cars and to place the derailed cars back on the track. This photo shows Amanda Durstein on the left and Clara Fassbender on the right, posing in front of the wreckage, holding empty cans of alcohol that fueled the fire after the crash. When all was said and done, 4 cars were burned, 2 more damaged by fire, and 15 other cars received other damage. The official railroad report of the accident later cited speed as the cause of the accident. Area longtimers may remember that the Ralph's Corner Shopping Center at 40-foot and Welsh Roads was named for the Ralph's supermarket that was originally located there in 1978. Ralph's Supermarket was originally Ralph's Market, which was started many years earlier in Lansdale by grocer Ralph B. Hedrick. In 1945, Ralph Hedrick lost 5 members of his family in a single horrific trolley accident. The Hedricks made their home on Squirrel Lane on the edge of Hatfield Township. The trolley route, shown here in yellow, at that time ran along Squirrel Lane and then curved north to run parallel to the railroad. Early in the evening of August 3, 1945, Ralph Hedrick's wife, Esther, and 3 of his children, Ella May, Harold, and Donald, Ralph's mother-in-law, Mrs. Ella K. Souter, and Ralph's nephew, Dale Rush, traveled in Mrs. Souter's car to see a doctor in North Wales, and then stopped at Ralph's self-service market in Lansdale. The 6 of them then left the store in Mrs. Souter's car and drove to return to the Hedricks' home. At about 8:35 p.m., the car turned from Squirrel Lane into the private driveway leading to their home, and while crossing the trolley tracks, a northbound high-speed trolley hit the car, dragging it some 50 to 75 feet before dropping it into a field alongside the tracks. The car was terribly crushed, trapping all 6 family members inside. Trolley passengers and neighbors immediately went to work removing the trapped family. The victims were taken to Elm Terrace Hospital by the hospital ambulance and the Fairmont Fire Company ambulance of Lansdale. Esther Hedrick and Ella Souter were pronounced dead without being removed from the ambulance. It was believed that both had died instantly of broken necks from the impact. The children were taken into the hospital, and 5-year-old Harold was immediately pronounced dead. The Hedricks' 5-week-old infant daughter, Ella May, was also pronounced dead 20 minutes later. 2-year-old nephew Dale suffered from a depressed skull fracture and underwent an emergency operation at the hospital during the night. He lived until Saturday afternoon, in spite of his serious injuries, and then died. 4-year-old Donald Hedrick, who suffered a serious compound fracture of the skull, a concussion, and a neck injury, survived the accident and eventually fully recovered. He alone was left to comfort his grieving father. This 1946 photo shows a railroad crossing watchman stopping traffic on Union Street for a northbound steam engine. With no advance notice, on September 6, 1951, 6 years after the tragic Hedrick accident, the Lehigh Valley Transit Company announced the end of trolley service on the Philadelphia to Allentown line. Passengers arrived at stations the next morning only to learn the disappointing news. Lehigh Valley Transit attempted substituting bus service for the trolleys, but the slow, indirect route was not a viable option for commuters, and buses were discontinued in 1956. On June 24, 1954, Walter Roach, age 64, of West Vine Street, was killed when he failed to stop his car for a northbound diesel train at the Vine Street crossing. The train slammed into the passenger side of Mr. Roach's Dodge Cornet and dragged the car 30 feet. Mr. Roach was thrown some 15 feet from the vehicle and suffered a fractured skull. As you can see, at the time, the Vine Street crossing was protected only by a standard railroad crossing sign and a stop, look, and listen sign. Walter Roach was a member of the Hatfield Chamber of Commerce, and soon after the accident that took Mr. Roach's life, the Chamber petitioned Hatfield Borough Council to contact the railroad about improving the safety of the borough's railroad crossings by adding better warning signals. 2 years later, in 1956, automated crossing gates were installed at the Main Street and Union Street crossings, and flashing lights were added to the Vine Street crossing. This helped to reduce accidents, but there were always those who chose to ignore the warnings. If you lived in Hatfield for a real long time, and I mean a really long time, you may remember when East Broad Street continued straight after crossing Market Street, through the railroad property, and across the railroad tracks before connecting to Maple Avenue. That ended in 1964 after a tragic accident that occurred at that railroad crossing. It was Saturday, February 8, 1964, and the Hatfield's noon fire siren had just sounded, signaling lunchtime for Hatfield's residents and workers. At about the same time, a diesel-powered 10-car freighter was leaving the R.T. French Company railroad siding a mile and a half north of Hatfield, heading south for Lansdale. With the sounding of the fire siren, Norman Bond, Barry Machete, and Mary Catherine Ziccarelli left their jobs at the Hanson Textile Factory on East Broad Street and climbed into the front seat of Barry's late-model two-door hardtop sedan. The car turned left onto Broad Street, and after stopping at Market Street, proceeded across Market Street onto the dirt-paved section of East Broad Street that would take them to Maple Avenue. The engineer of the freight train saw the car approaching the railroad crossing, which was protected by a flashing light warning signal, and assumed that it would stop. He sounded the whistle, but soon became aware, although too late, that the car was not going to stop at the crossing. The car didn't make it across before being struck by the train on the driver's side. 19-year-old Mary Catherine Ziccarelli of East Vine Street had been sitting on the passenger side of the front seat and was tossed out of the car window about 25 feet from the point of impact. In this photo, aid is being given to the young woman. She was rendered unconscious by the accident and suffered head and brain injuries, a fractured pelvis and hip, and abdominal injuries. Mercifully, she remained unconscious for many days, except for a brief moment the next day when she was able to recognize her mother. As the train continued to push the car south along the tracks, 29-year-old Norman Bond of the Village Scene Trailer Park, who was sitting in the center of the front seat, was thrown some 50 feet from the car and apparently was killed instantly. The freighter continued to push the automobile an estimated 1,000 feet from the point of impact before coming to a halt. 21-year-old Barry Machete of West Vine Street was left pinned inside the twisted wreckage. He was also mercifully knocked unconscious by the accident. He was critically injured, suffering serious chest and head injuries and multiple lacerations of the body. It took rescuers nearly a half an hour to extricate him from the wreckage. It took workers another 2 hours to clear the tracks of the wreckage and allow the train to proceed to its destination. The wrecked car was towed to the Gulf Station at Cowpath and Orvilla Roads, where it was an attraction for curiosity seekers through the remainder of the weekend. Hundreds of people gathered there, actually creating a traffic jam at times to gawk at the mangled car. These photos are dated June 9, 1967, and show the aftermath of a collision of a train with a car at the Main Street crossing near the main hotel. Unfortunately, our newspaper collection does not include the edition that would contain an article about this accident, so we have no details about it. The crossing was protected by flashing warning lights, a warning bell, and crossing arm gates, so it is a mystery how this could have happened. That's the Hatfield Borough police car on the left with Chief Herb Kreider talking to possible witnesses. It's possible that the warning devices malfunctioned, or perhaps the driver decided to ignore the warnings and tried to navigate around the crossing arms. Whatever the cause, it's hard to imagine that anyone in this vehicle would have been able to survive the terrible crash. Over the next 15 years, reduced ridership finally led to the discontinuation of commuter service on the Lansdale to Bethlehem branch on July 26, 1981. The line continues to be used for freight, but at slower speeds, and I can't recall another train accident on it since commuter service was stopped. Well, this program certainly wasn't one of those feel-good programs of reminiscing about Hatfield's past, but I hope that you have enjoyed learning a bit about the history of trains and trolleys in Hatfield and the dangers that they brought. Thanks for watching.